As I'm sure most of you well know, last year, 2017, marked the anniversary of the 80th year of the death of Antonio Gransci in 1937 under the fascist government in Italy. Gramsci was and is for many perhaps the most innovative political and cultural thinker of the 20th century, a century that has shaped his formation and to which he dedicated a large part of his thinking. A figure whose thought has undergone many reinventions and uses, from the subaltern studies group of postcolonial thought to the Birmingham Cultural Studies School of Stuart Hall, but also in less coherent fashion and more capillary ways in women's leftist groups, anti-capitalist struggles, and social movements at large. Hegemony, passive revolution, philosophy of praxis, cosmopolitanism in a new modernity are only the most widespread terms that we have been accustomed to hear or read about, at least in passing, whether or not they have been used with cognizance and accuracy. So much has been written on Gramsci in Europe and in the world, but the far-reaching potential of his thought, to borrow and rephrase Arrighi, we could say, Gramsci's simultaneous close and distant reading, of which we have become aware perhaps only in the last decades, and the deeply felt effects of the contemporary crisis, which is not contemporary at all, but has shown some of its crudest effects in the present, make it seem only natural to us organizers to shape an event addressing Gramsci's thought and the legacy of such thinking. A legacy that we want to think of as historically placed, contingent, but also projected into the future. And this is perhaps the only possible understanding of history. We have thought of organizing the conference through a lineup of speakers rather than concurrent panels to enhance the possibilities of interrogation, discussion, and exchange in dialogic fashion. Speaking from a personal viewpoint, which is a feminist standpoint, I want to think of the space, which is also a word of language and imagination, as a knitting of the intimacy of thought. Gramsci the man and Gramsci the myth. It is enough to look at social media to realize how often Gramsci has been quoted. Yet despite the large number of scholars and interpreters, there is no definitive word. We are far from having accomplished a last version of Gramsci because, as will become clear from the discussion, we don't own the complete works of Gramsci. What we have is articles of newspapers, letters, private and public, interventions on his managing activity, and the prison notebooks that are a posthumous work. Theoretical and political discussions are based on available material, which in turn has undergone interpretative work before being put together, and interpretations depend on methodologies as well as the political moment. As Professor Giuseppe Vacca pointed out during this morning's workshop, the first critical edition of Gramsci's work dates back to 1975, which marks a watershed moment in Gramscian studies, while the last 10 years have marked a new season of Gramscian studies. We will hear more about all this in the course of our conference. As we reconnect Gramsci's thought to the political specificities of our present, we will also unravel meanings and interpretations and see not only what is specific in Gramsci. Gramsci's notion of consent cannot be equal to Foucault's notion of consent, for example, in my view, but how contingency and specificity are empowering modes for future usages and rearticulations. I don't want to spend too long a time in my opening address because I'm sure you're eager to hear from the speakers themselves. I simply wanted to conclude with a reminder. Gramsci's beginnings are anything but privileged. He was born at the end of the 19th century in Sardinia, at the time a very poor region of Italy, often lumped together as the South, but there are many Souths, in fact, in Italy and in the world altogether. His father was arrested when he was a child, and the mother had a hard time in keeping the family going and simply feeding it. The young Antonio would suffer tremendously in health and spirit for the conditions he lived in at his very young age. He underwent many difficulties to study and work, experiencing firsthand the world of migration to the industrial north of Italy, and witnessing the new subject which he saw emerging from the industrial proletariat of the time. He was a man who saw himself as a political writer pressed by the developments of political struggle. And perhaps it was because of those struggles that he was able to see and imagine the possibility of an alternative universalism, one which would not be reduced to the logic of capital. 100 years separate us from Gramsci's lifetime, more or less. Our world is so different, but some of its structures remarkably similar. Apparently it takes a long time for history to become history. And I cannot think of a better time to come together and think together of legacies of the future. And without further ado, I want to introduce now our first keynote speaker for tonight, Dr. Peter Ives. Dr. Ives is a professor at the University of Winnipeg, where he teaches in political science. His research interests include the role of language in political and democratic theory, cultural studies, Marxism, critical theory, and feminism. And I found out that Peter wrote an undergraduate thesis on the Icelandic Women's Alliance. This, I was very proud of Peter. His current project, funded by Antonio Gransci, investigates the intersections between language politics and global capitalism, and specifically the politics of global English. Dr. Ives has extensively published on Gramsci and the politics of language, and I will not give the long list of his publications. You can check it out on the website. But I want to highlight a few titles which were quite interesting for me personally, since I teach literature and cultural theory. Language and Hegemony in Gramsci, published by Pluto Press. Gramsci's Politics of Language, Engaging the Bakhtin Circle and the Frankfurt School, published by the Toronto University Press, with the Rockwell Accord, Gramsci, Language and Translation, with Thomas Risento and Yale Peeled, Language Policy and Political Theory.